Somewhere in a box of old family papers, or in a courthouse archive, or filed under a name you barely recognize as your own, there is a record. It might be a prisoner of war registration card with a German address, a military unit designation, and a photograph of a young man who looks nothing like anyone you know and exactly like someone you have seen in your own mirror. For millions of Americans, that record exists. Most of them have never seen it. The story of how German prisoners of war became American ancestors is not one story. It is at least three separated by nearly 2 centuries of American history, and each one left behind surnames that are still carried today by families who may not have any idea where those names originally came from, or how the men who bore them ended up on American soil. The oldest thread begins in the autumn of 1776, during a war that most people think of as a conflict between Americans and the British. The British were certainly involved, but the fighting force Britain deployed against the Continental Army included approximately 30,000 German soldiers from the various German principalities, predominantly from Hesse-Kassel, Hesse-Hanau, Brunswick, Ansbach-Bayreuth, Waldeck, and Anhalt-Zerbst. They were hired, in the way that sovereign powers hired armies before the age of nationalism, by the British Crown, which paid the German princes handsomely for the use of their troops. The American colonists who wrote pamphlets against them called them Hessians, using the name of the largest supplier as shorthand for all the German auxiliaries, and the term has stuck in historical memory ever since. These men were not mercenaries in the freelance sense. They were professional soldiers of the German army states, transferred to British service under treaty arrangements that paid their princes by the head. The soldiers themselves received their regular wages, wore their regimental uniforms, and fought under their own officers. What they were not were volunteers in any ideological cause. Many of them had limited understanding of what the American conflict was about, and even less personal stake in its outcome. When things went badly, as they did for a significant number of Hessian units, the men who were captured faced a choice that no amount of regimental loyalty could resolve for them in a predictable direction. The most famous moment of Hessian capture in the Revolutionary War was the Battle of Trenton on the morning of December 26, 1776. George Washington crossed the Delaware River in the pre-dawn darkness with 2,400 Continental soldiers, struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton before they had fully recovered from the Christmas holiday, and captured approximately 900 prisoners in a fight that lasted less than 2 hours. The Hessian commander, Colonel Johann Rall, was mortally wounded and died that afternoon. His men were marched westward through Pennsylvania as prisoners. The impact on morale across both sides of the conflict was enormous, and the captured Hessians who walked through the streets of Philadelphia in their distinctive uniforms became one of the most visible demonstrations that the Continental Army could win. But Trenton was only one engagement among many. Over the course of the entire Revolutionary War, somewhere between 12,000 and 17,000 of the approximately 30,000 German auxiliaries who served in the British forces did not return to Germany. Historians disagree on the exact figure and on the proportions represented by battlefield deaths, desertion during the war, and post-war settlement. What is not disputed is that a substantial fraction of the Hessian and other German auxiliary force became permanent American residents, and their descendants are among us now. The conditions that made post-war German settlement possible were specific to the social geography of the early American Republic. German immigrants had been arriving in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and New York since the early 18th century, and by the time of the Revolution, there were established German-speaking communities throughout the region. A Hessian soldier who deserted, was paroled, or simply walked away from a prisoner of war camp after the war ended could in many cases find his way into one of these communities and begin a life with a degree of cultural familiarity that would have been impossible somewhere else. The Pennsylvania Dutch country of Lancaster, York, and Berks counties was not Dutch at all. It was overwhelmingly German, settled by Lutheran and Reformed immigrants from the same regions that supplied the Hessian troops, and it absorbed former prisoners and deserters in numbers that are difficult to count precisely because many of those men made deliberate efforts to integrate quietly rather than call attention to their histories. The surnames they carried into American records came directly from their German origins. Some remained unchanged. A man named Brauer stayed Brauer. A man named Schaefer became Schaffer or Shavers, depending on who was writing down the name and in what county. German umlaut vowels were simplified. Letters that had no English equivalent were approximated. The same underlying name could produce half a dozen American spellings within a single generation, and the further those families moved from the original German-speaking communities, the more the spelling drifted from the original. The surnames most commonly found in genealogical research connected to Hessian Revolutionary War service cluster around certain phonetic and etymological patterns. Family names derived from German place names were common in this period. Hessler, meaning someone from Hesse itself, appears in Pennsylvania records from the 1780s and 1790s in families whose German origins are documentable. Rahl and Rahl, variants of the name of the Trenton commander, appear in the genealogical records of York and Lancaster counties. Grebe, a name from the infantry regiments, shows up in the same period in communities that had known Hessian prisoner populations. Occupational surnames, which were extremely common in German naming conventions, produce some of the most ambiguous cases for genealogists because German occupational names frequently have English equivalents that obscure the connection. Müller became Miller. Schmidt became Smith. Zimmerman became Carpenter or Zimmerman, depending on the community. A family named Miller in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania in 1790 might have entirely English Quaker roots, or they might have arrived in America as a prisoner of war named Mueller 14 years earlier. The census records alone cannot settle the question. It requires the combination of tax lists, church records, land patents, and where they survive, prisoner of war lists from the Continental Army to establish the connection. The Continental Army did maintain records of Hessian and other German soldiers, though the quality and completeness of those records varied considerably. Some regiments were well documented. The record of prisoners taken at Trenton was kept with some care because the Battle of Trenton was itself well documented as a propaganda moment for the American cause. The prisoners of other engagements were sometimes listed in detail and sometimes listed in aggregate numbers that tell the historian how many men were taken, but not who they were. Significant holdings of Hessian regimental records survived in German archives, particularly in the Hessian State Archive in Marburg, which maintains the records of the Hesse-Kassel military establishment. Cross-referencing American genealogical records against Marburg holdings is now possible through digitization programs that have made thousands of these records searchable online. The second thread of this story belongs to the First World War, and it is shorter and less documented than the Revolutionary War chapter, but no less consequential for the specific families it affected. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, there were approximately 500,000 German nationals living in the country who became enemy aliens by definition under the Alien Enemies Act. Several thousand of these men were interned for the duration of the conflict, held primarily at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia and Hot Springs in North Carolina. These were not battlefield prisoners of war. They were civilian residents, many of them long-established businessmen, professionals, and workers, who were detained as a precaution against espionage and sabotage. The conditions at the World War I internment camps were generally more comfortable than what was typical of wartime military detention elsewhere. The men at Fort Oglethorpe organized orchestras, theatrical productions, and sporting events. They maintained social hierarchies from the German-American community they had come from, and they were eventually released when the war ended. But the experience of internment, combined with the virulent anti-German sentiment that characterized the American home front during the war, pushed many German-American families into a pattern of name suppression that has complicated genealogical research ever since. Families named Kaiser, Koenig, Vogel, and Brown, who had lived openly under those names for a generation before 1917, sometimes quietly anglicized or simply stopped using their German names in official documents by 1920. The third and largest thread begins in 1943, and it is the one that most directly explains German surnames appearing in mid-20th century American genealogical records in families with no prior German immigration history. Between 1943 and 1946, The United States held approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war in over 500 camps spread across 38 states. The scale of this program has no American precedent before or since. At its peak, in mid-1945, German POWs outnumbered the entire population of several American states. The camps ranged from major facilities holding several thousand prisoners to small branch camps attached to farms, canneries, and other labor operations. Camp Algona in Iowa held over 10,000 prisoners at various times and became so integrated into the local economy that German POW labor was essential to the Iowa agricultural harvest for 2 consecutive years. Camp Ruston in Louisiana, Camp McCain in Mississippi, Camp Concordia in Kansas, Fort Robinson in Nebraska, Florence in Arizona, Scottsbluff in Nebraska, Camp Blanding in Florida, and dozens of other installations across the country housed men who came from every region of Germany, every social class, and every branch of the German armed forces. The names on the camp rosters read like a cross-section of German family naming conventions of the early 20th century. Lange, Huber, Brauer, Fuchs, Vogel, Seidel, Dietrich, Holtz, Baum, Kraus, Mann, Bergmann, Richter, Berner, Bohm, which appeared in American records as Boehm or Bohm, Schreiber, Haas, Frank, Pfeiffer, which appeared as Piper or retained its German spelling, Feldman, Ritter. These were not exotic names. They were ordinary surnames of ordinary German men who had been conscripted into a military machine that sent them across the Atlantic and deposited them, through the mechanism of surrender or capture, into the American interior. The Geneva Convention governed their treatment, and in the aggregate, the American prisoner of war program adhered more carefully to those provisions than the programs of most other belligerent powers. German prisoners were housed in barracks rather than cages, were paid a small wage for their labor, were provided with recreational facilities, and were not subjected to coercive interrogation. They worked in agriculture, in lumber, in food processing, and in various service roles on military installations. They ate American food in quantities that often exceeded what was available to civilians in Germany at the time. Several thousand of them took the opportunity of their captivity to study English, complete correspondence courses, and in some cases to develop relationships with American civilians that outlasted the war. The question of how many of these men stayed in America is one that genealogists and historians have been trying to answer with precision for decades. The official process required repatriation. All German POWs were supposed to return to Germany by the summer of 1946. The repatriation did occur, but some men returned. The legal mechanism for a former German POW to immigrate to the United States was not simple, but it was navigable. And the men who had spent 2 or 3 years in American camps, who had learned English, who had formed genuine attachments to the communities where they had worked, had both the motivation and, in some cases, the social support to find their way back. The relationships that made return immigration most likely were those formed with American women. A German prisoner who had worked on a farm in Wisconsin or a canning operation in California and developed a relationship with a woman there had a compelling reason to attempt legal immigration once the initial repatriation period ended. Some of these relationships had been built in the face of significant social disapproval. Fraternization between German prisoners and American civilians was officially prohibited during the war, though the prohibition was unevenly enforced and became increasingly difficult to maintain as the camps became integrated into local agricultural and industrial labor systems. The camp commanders who looked the other way at working relationships that crossed into personal territory were not rare, and the correspondence that continued after repatriation and the immigration applications that followed are documented in National Archives records that have been increasingly accessible to researchers. A former prisoner named Werner Schmid, who had worked at a camp in Texas, been repatriated in 1946, and then applied for immigration to the United States under the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, or through the regular immigration quota system, was doing something that hundreds of men attempted and a meaningful fraction accomplished. His children, born in the United States in the early 1950s, would carry the surname Schmid or Schmidt or any of its American variants into American census records, school records, draft registrations, and eventually into genealogical databases where their descendants might find them today. The research tools that connect present-day family members to these histories have improved substantially over the last 2 decades. The National Archives in College Park, Maryland holds the records of the World War II Prisoner of War Information Bureau, which include individual prisoner files for a significant portion of the German POWs held in the United States. These files can include personal information, camp assignments, work detail records, and in some cases, disciplinary records or escape attempt documentation. The German Federal Archives in Freiburg maintains German military personnel records that survived the war and can be used to confirm the service history of a man whose American documents identify him as a former prisoner. The International Tracing Service, now called the Arelson Archives, maintains a massive collection of documents related to the movement of persons during and after the Second World War, including prisoner of war records. The German Red Cross conducted post-war tracing operations that generated their own documentation. Ancestry.com has indexed portions of the World War II POW records accessible through the National Archives, and the digitization of these records is ongoing through projects at both American and German institutions. For the Revolutionary War period, the research pathway is different in methodology, but not in principle. The Hessian State Archive in Marburg maintains the muster rolls and regimental records of the Hesse-Kassel forces and has digitized substantial portions of their holdings. The German Genealogy Group and similar organizations have created surname indices from these records that can be searched against American family trees. The Pennsylvania State Archives, the Maryland State Archives, and the Virginia Archives all hold colonial-era records that document German-origin settlers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and cross-referencing those records against Hessian military rosters is the primary method by which researchers establish Hessian POW descent. The surnames that emerge from this research are not always the ones that look German at first glance. The process of anglicization, combined with phonetic spelling by American clerks who had no German language background, produced transformations that are sometimes difficult to trace without knowledge of German naming conventions. A family named Sowers in the Virginia Shenandoah Valley descended from a family named Sauer. A family named Fouth descended from Fouts. A family named Swisher descended from Schweitzer. A family named Baumann descended from Baumann. The English-looking spelling of these surnames conceals a German origin, and without genealogical research that traces the family back beyond the first American-born generation, the connection to Hessian military service is easy to miss. The most productive approach for anyone with possible Hessian ancestry is to trace the family geographically. The communities with the highest concentrations of Hessian Revolutionary War integration were in a band running through southeastern Pennsylvania, through western Maryland, and into the northern Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. German-speaking churches in this region, particularly Lutheran and German Reformed congregations, kept parish records that document the arrival of new families in the decades immediately after the Revolution, and these records sometimes include information about origins that census records do not preserve. A family appearing in a Lutheran church register in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, for the first time in 1783 with a surname that appears on a Hessian regimental muster roll is a family whose history connects to the events of the Revolutionary War in ways that most family members have never imagined. There's something specific about learning that a name you carry, whether that name is obviously German or has been transformed into something that sounds entirely American, arrived in this country through the particular mechanism of military captivity. The men who bore those names did not choose to come here through the ordinary channels of emigration, through the decision to leave one country and build a life in another. They came as prisoners, as conscripts, as soldiers of states and causes that were not their own, and they stayed because the war ended and the country where they found themselves was, in the event, more hospitable than the one they had been shipped from. The names they left in American records are not footnotes to the history of American immigration. They are part of it, and the families who carry those names are connected to a history that is older and stranger and more specific than the general story of German American immigration that the history books typically tell.